NASCAR has had some crazy races over the past decade. The schedule has been constantly changing since 2018, and as a result, the layout of certain new tracks has led to absolute chaos. In addition to this, weather and other factors have contributed to creating some of the most ridiculous, destructive, and unhinged races we have ever seen. So let's dive into modern NASCAR's most insane races. The first race on this list comes from before the schedule change era that started in 2018. The 2017 Brickyard 400 was, like many races at Indianapolis Motor Speedway, marked by close battles, crashes, and destruction. It started out fairly calm. Kyle Busch led the first 70 laps and won Stage 1. After this, a small incident took out Dale Jr. in his last race at Indy, but then, at the start of Stage 3, the two drivers that had dominated most of the race found themselves out.
Oh, Kyle Busch slides and does the 78. They both go up into the wall through turn 1. Caution comes out.
Lock her down.
After this dramatic moment, the remaining 50 laps were packed with insanity. Clint Bowyer and Kurt Busch had a big crash on the front straightaway, with Bowyer narrowly missing the pit entrance wall. After this, another front stretch wreck took out Kyle Larson, and a 2-lap shootout was on hand. Kasey Kahne led the restart and intensely fought Brad Keselowski, while Jimmie Johnson, with an engine that was blowing up, somehow powered his way to make it 3 wide for the lead, for what could have been his last ever NASCAR win. But he lost the car into turn 3 and wiped out.
Around goes the 48! The 48 blows up and into the wall it goes!
On the following restart, everyone instantly crashed, and on the final restart, a big crash on the backstretch occurred, and NASCAR controversially waited to throw the caution until after Kasey Kahne had reached the overtime line, which ended the race instead of creating another restart. It was a controversial and chaotic race from the middle to finish, and it was capped off by Kahne's upset victory, his final win in his Cup Series career. NASCAR's first race on the Charlotte Roval was one of its most insane ones in history. In fact, the entire weekend was crazy. A warning of what was to come occurred when the pace car spun out in practice 1. Meanwhile, the new track layout featured an extremely high-speed chicane on the backstretch, and drivers had to absolutely send it through the left-right arrangement. But NASCAR soon found out that they had made a big mistake. The wall after this chicane was too far out into the track, and numerous drivers tore up their cars in practice by hitting it, including Austin Dillon, Ryan Blaney, Eric Jones, and Bubba Wallace. To add insult to injury, a poorly placed curb caused some of these drivers like Jones to be launched into the air for just a slight mistake. The wall was grazed a few more times in qualifying before NASCAR made the wise decision to remove it for the race, but the race itself was still chaotic, particularly in the closing laps. On a late race restart, Brad Keselowski's controller disconnected, and he went straight into the wall from the lead, causing a pileup. After this, a final battle between Jimmie Johnson, who was again fighting for what could have been his last win, and Martin Truex Jr. ensued. Entering the final chicane, Johnson locked the brakes, spun, and took out Truex like a bowling pin, which handed the win to Ryan Blaney. Meanwhile, this was disastrous for Johnson's point standings, as he would get eliminated from the playoffs by Kyle Larson making a last-moment pass, bouncing off the wall in his destroyed car. While this was happening, after the checkered flag, Martin Truex Jr. rammed into the back of Jimmie Johnson in revenge. When the dust had settled, the 2018 Charlotte Roval was one of the most insane weekends in NASCAR history. If you want pure chaos, the 2020 Clash was it. This race was nothing more than a glorified demolition derby, at least after the first 65 laps. What's funny is that of the 12-minute highlight video posted by NBC, 9 minutes come within the last 10 laps in overtime. It started with Logano, Kyle Busch, and Brad Keselowski crashing, then it was an instant pile-up on the ensuing restart. After this, they almost ran a full clean lap, but ultimately crashed in turn 3, and then one more wreck occurred in turn 4. Note one of the drivers who was involved. On the final restart, there were only 6 cars in the entire field. Not 6 cars on the lead lap, but 6 cars even running, and even half the runners had damage. Despite bouncing off the wall and falling to the back, Eric Jones, with the help of his lap-down teammate, pulled out the win with his demolished and destroyed race car. One of the craziest race wins of all time. NASCAR's first race at the Circuit of the Americas was also the first official rain race in the history of the Cup Series, and it was a wild one. As the rain worsened, drivers struggled to keep their cars straight, and more crucially, visibility became extraordinarily low. This extreme mist caused Kevin Harvick to lift and get plowed into on the straightaway, in a crash that NBC couldn't even catch on camera. Later, a very similar crash occurred, as Martin Truex Jr. crashed into Michael McDowell without seeing him, and Cole Custer absolutely demolished Truex, nearly flipping him, because he couldn't see anything either. After this, NASCAR put out the red flag and waited for the rain to lessen, and resumed the race with single-file restarts. They ran clean for a little while longer, but when the heavy rain returned, the race was again red flagged and called short, with Chase Elliott winning. Despite the truncated ending, it remains one of the most chaotic races in recent memory. So we've seen a race where NASCAR prepared for the rain and it still descended into anarchy, but what if they didn't even know it was raining? A few months later in New Hampshire, this very thing would happen. When the green flag was dropped, everything seemed dry despite the overcast skies, and the field was able to run a few clean laps. But around lap 5, some began to notice raindrops, and NASCAR did not put out a caution flag. When leader Kyle Busch entered turn 1 on lap 6, he completely lost traction in the rain and slammed the wall, and he was followed by several other drivers in losing control. Martin Truex Jr. also crashed out, and Denny Hamlin spun as others ran wide. Longtime NASCAR fans instantly remember the 2001 All-Star race and how the drivers that unfairly crashed out on lap 1 due to rain were given the chance to move to a backup car, but NASCAR decided to not allow it this time as the crashes occurred on lap 6 instead of lap 1. The race was a points race instead of an exhibition, and there were only 2 cars that received significant damage compared to the 4 in 2001. This decision obviously did not please Kyle Busch, who had already run into the back of the pace car to show his frustration. The rest of the race was pretty typical for Loudon. A few incidents and some decent racing. It was capped off by an extremely unexpected upset victory by Aric Almirola, however, which ended up being his 3rd and final Cup Series win. A few weeks later, absolute bedlam would go down at NASCAR's first race on the Indianapolis road course. Things started out relatively clean, but we saw how turn 1 was capable of creating anarchy on restarts. A few laps later, we received a hint of what was to come when Denny Hamlin almost came to blows with a curb and had to swerve out of the way to avoid it. Throughout the race, there were some notable incidents, like Aric Almirola getting his fender smashed in, and then underdogs Tyler Reddick and Michael McDowell fighting for the win in Stage 1. Stage 2 saw Ross Chastain and Brad Keselowski spinning early, but soon calmed down and gave way to another stage win for Reddick. On the Stage 3 restart, the field began to stack up and cut turn 1, but everyone made it through okay. So far, so good. With 10 laps to go, some kind of debris emerged from underneath the 53 car as he ran over a curb. NASCAR didn't think too much about it and threw a caution to pick up the debris and quickly restart the race. But after the following restart, as drivers ran over that curb, again debris began to fly everywhere, and this time Martin Truex Jr. spun out. The race remained green though, and an intense battle began between Denny Hamlin and rookie Chase Briscoe. Chase locked up into turn 1 and they began to beat and bang for the lead. But once again, they approached the suspicious curb, and this time it would take no prisoners.
All of that contact between the 2 leaders is allowed. Oh, the 24's spinning! The 24's, there's multiple cars into the wall here on the racetrack right there in turn. We got more cars coming in! William Byron is reporting that the curb came up.
The curb had been lifted off the ground and was destroying cars and tires that ran over it. William Byron, Joey Logano, Kyle Busch, Daniel Suarez, Christopher Bell, Kevin Harvick, Ryan Preece, and others had fallen victim to the curb of death. The race was red flagged, and upon evaluating the curb, NASCAR decided the safest and quickest resolution would be to remove it altogether. So they did, and the race was restarted for an overtime shootout. At this point, the drivers were losing their minds, and they barely made it through the first few turns and back to the curb. But once again, when they reached it, something that NASCAR had not foreseen would happen.
He walks 3rd, but he's got to get around A.J. Allmendinger to do it. Bubba Wallace on course.
You see, the problem with removing the small curb is that it was there to ease the blow of the larger turtle curb, and without it, the turtle curb simply acts as a ramp placed in the middle of a NASCAR race. At this point, NASCAR decided to just restart the race anyway and hope that no one would hit the curb again. On the restart, Chase Briscoe went wide into turn 1 and cut the corner through the grass, which put him side by side for the lead. As they came to the curb, everyone watching held their breath, but they somehow made it through with only Ryan Newman bouncing off of it and Brad Keselowski spinning out. Meanwhile, up front, Chase Briscoe received a stop-and-go penalty for cutting the track, but he didn't comprehend this, continued to fight for the win, and spun Denny Hamlin out. This gave part-time driver A.J. Allmendinger the lead, and with the field more spread out, they were able to make it past the curb one last time and finish the race once and for all. When it was finally over, it instantly went down as one of the most asinine, chaotic, and memorable races in all of NASCAR history. And even though I will always know it as the curb race, it still had an entertaining and classic NASCAR finish. I feel like I couldn't make this list without including a Bristol dirt race, but their craziness was really spread out over the 3 events from 2021 to 2023, so I'm just going to mention some of the crazy moments from each race. 2021 had issues with visibility and dirt blocking the radiator of cars. The radiator problem was so bad that Kyle Busch had to pit on lap 10 as he was losing water. Meanwhile, the visibility reached such a poor point that the entire track looked like a scene out of Mad Max and pile-ups ensued. And there was also the 2 best dirt racers in the field, Kyle Larson and Christopher Bell, crashing into each other. There were so many cautions in this race that they eventually moved to single-file restarts. The next year had a crazy finish, with Chase Briscoe trying to slide past Tyler Reddick for the win in the final corner, but he ended up swiping Reddick, they both spun onto the apron, and Kyle Busch from way back in 3rd barely snagged the win at the line. In the final Bristol dirt race in 2023, there were 14 cautions, but more notably, Michael McDowell pulled off not one, but 2 360 spins and continued racing like nothing happened. While many fans, myself included, were happy to return to the Bristol concrete configuration in 2024, the 3-year run of insanity on the Bristol dirt track might never be matched again, and certainly had its fun moments. Similar to New Hampshire in 2021, the 2022 Coke 0400 was pretty typical for the most part. It had been rained out and postponed to Sunday afternoon, and was your average Daytona race, complete with a few wrecks. That was until 23 laps to go, when the field ran into turn 1 without realizing it was raining, and virtually everybody crashed. The race was reduced to 10 lead lap runners for the final stretch, and with only a few laps to go and many competitors suffering from damage, Austin Dillon snatched the lead from Austin Cindric by punting him out of the way and cruising to the checkered flag. It was remarkable how NASCAR had made the same exact mistake of not throwing the caution flag for rain that they had made a year prior at New Hampshire. NASCAR has since said that they've added more spotters to warn race control of rain, so we can only hope that's sorted out for the drivers and teams. The final insane race on this list is 2024 Nashville. The first 200 laps were fairly calm. There were some interesting moments like Denny Hamlin bumping Kyle Larson under caution, but with about 100 laps to go, cautions began to pop up left and right. Austin Dillon ran into Brad Keselowski, and Carson Hocevar spun out Harrison Burton under yellow, which Hocevar was later fined and penalized for. Then things ran green for about 40 laps, and it looked like we were about to get a classic finish between Ross Chastain and Denny Hamlin when Austin Cindric spun. On the restart, Kyle Larson sent it too hard and crashed out Ross Chastain. On the next restart, a crash in the rear of the field on the backstretch would force the third overtime. At this point, drivers were beginning to run low on fuel, and Kyle Larson ran out of gas on the restart and caused Kyle Busch to crash. At this point, heading into the fourth overtime, most of the leaders realized they were about to run out of fuel and pitted. Joey Logano and Chase Briscoe, among others, still refused to, though, and somehow didn't run out. Yet another crash right before the start-finish line forced the fifth overtime, and it seems certain that Logano would run out of fuel at this point, having run over 100 laps on his tank. But still, he refused to pit, and somehow on old tires and fumes, he held back Tyler Reddick for his only win of the regular season, which locked him into the playoffs and created a huge domino effect as he went on to win the championship. Without the anarchy at the end of the Nashville race, Joey Logano would not have won his third title, and he even had enough fuel to do some burnouts. So those are my picks for some of the most insane NASCAR Cup races over the past decade or so. Let me know if you think I missed any, and thanks for watching, everyone.